Hi everyone, welcome to our weekly webinar. This is number 5 in our series so far, and we're really fortunate today to be joined by Bree Lindsay, who's the Senior Program Analyst at California Council on Science and Technology. So before we formally start with Bree, I just want to run through a couple of updates for the week. The first thing, whoops, just jumped ahead, sorry. This week was published a new report from the Institute for the Future and the California Community College Chancellor's Office on charting new paths for the future. I've included the link here, and we really want you to take advantage of this publication to share with your college community and your leadership, particularly because it features CCC Maker as one of the innovative strategies that the Chancellor's Office is using to achieve several of their outcomes in this new strategic approach. And though we're listed under the section Unbounded Resources, which is this red thread running through the middle, if you look at the outcomes that the Chancellor's Office is looking for, these are all items that are within our CCC Maker purview, particularly things like dynamic reputations for badging and micro-credentialing, personalized experience through project-based learning and student entrepreneurship, and also digital and physical blends when we're talking about the mix between our analog craft-based making and our digital fabrication tools, and continuous learning flow, etc. So this is a really important document for creating a very clearly communicated overview of the Chancellor's Office strategy, and we are an integral part to that work. So make the most of it. This is really good. This is really good work for us to use to share out and communicate with our community. In other highlights, and still again, let's get on to Workplace, because that's where all of this information is being posted. And I've included a couple of other elements here that will be added to work that are already on Workplace. But first off, Karen would like to make everyone aware that there is also an app available for Workplace. You can download onto your phone, and Karen actually said that she finds it really easy to use, and it's probably going to be the way a lot of people are going to work with us on Workplace. Also, the latest CCC Maker newsletter is out. You should be receiving it if you are on the constant contact list. If you're not, I've put a link in here for the link from the Workplace site, and also from our website you can sign up and get a regular delivery of the newsletter. A couple of events from local colleges. College of the Canyons is participating in a family literacy festival this weekend with their local library. And I just wanted to really call this out, because we're seeing a lot of our colleges are starting to really work with their local libraries, both as formal partners and through informal arrangements on these types of activities. So the libraries are really starting to make become a really valuable resource within our ecosystem. And Bree is also going to be talking later today about the importance of libraries and makerspaces. Just another reminder on the symposia, we have 2 coming up next year, Glendale Community College on the 16th, and in mid-April in Northern California at Folsom Lake College. We'll be looking at work-based learning in the South. We'll be looking at making across the curriculum in the North. And these symposia are going to be led primarily by the colleges. So there'll be a lot of work on developing presentations and panels that will help you share the knowledge that you've and experience that you're gaining from this project so far. And the work that we're interested in coming out of this symposia can also form the basis of white papers that can be submitted for the next ISAM conference and other conferences. So that's something that we'll be working on, is helping you develop your own publications to share out your message within an academic forum. And once again, the MakerEd convening is coming up next May. A couple of quick updates from the our operational side. The FCCC contracts were all sent out last week. Your college should have received them, and you should be working to get those on your board packets as quickly as you can. We've also prepared a site evaluation form which would be completed for any off-site internship. That form is itself from the Foundation office, and we've adapted it to Smartsheet so that you can fill it out easily online. Also, we recently recorded a webinar on the internship system, and there's a link there to that recording. On Makerspaces, I just wanted to give a shout out to Cabrillo, because they don't have their Makerspace up and running formally yet, but they're taking a great they're taking advantage of the roll up to the grand opening by having a series of what they're calling sneak peeks. And I think this is a really good idea, that and it reinforces that you don't necessarily need your Makerspace up and running in order to be growing your community and doing maker-based activities. So that's a strong one. We had a visit. We have several teams signed up for the Stanford Innovation Fellows, and they recently visited the Google headquarters as part of this project in developing student leadership. You can check that out. Once again, there's a link on Workplace. And also there's a conversation that we've been having recently within our project team about the importance of community in creating inclusive makerspaces. And so I've included a couple of posts from Carol, who's actually here with us today. You might want to even comment on this, Carol. And this is really interesting research that she's come across. Do you want to say a few words? No, you're fine? Okay. But there are links there on the on Workplace, so go check them out. Very interesting. Also, just on the operational side, I sent out an email to the project leads with the links for the second quarter reports, which are due in mid-January, and also included a list of recommendations for some best practices on what you can include in your quarterly reports, some advice about ways to think about how to report on your progress or on challenges and other issues, and just a couple of sort of basic technical things about entering numerical data in data fields, etc. So it's intended as a guide to help you improve your reporting. Many of you are already doing most of the things on the list, but I thought it would be good to share out all the advice to all of the colleges. So this is the point where we go over to Bree, who's going to be talking about recent developments in academic makerspaces. And you can see here, this is a photo of Bree and Zach and Dominic, and we're at the ISAM conference. When was that? Man, that was recently. That was just September, I think. And I'm sorry, Bree,
I was muted.
So I've included some background to what Bree's going to talk about today. First is there's a link to the webinar, which is on our website from last year. So this is the second year that Bree has chosen to present this work for us. And the thing that's great is that she's able to see it in the context of what was presented last year. So she'll be able to identify what's changing and what's different. I've also included the two white papers that were presented at ISAM. Carol and Paul presented last year at the 2016 ISAM. And then this year we also presented on the work that we've been doing through the startup process. And I've also included a link to our Workplace for a presentation by Amy Schultz of NACE, who presented on ecosystem ecosystem mapping, and she references the CCC Maker project. So there's 3 white papers for reference and last year's webinar on the presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Bree now, and we can either run it through this presentation, Bree, if you want. I can just click the slides forward, or we can stop sharing and you can pull yours up, whichever.
I think I'll do it so that I don't get distracted saying, okay, slide.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to stop sharing and then you'll share yours. Great.
Okay. Hopefully I can do it right now. Okay.
Great, that's working.
You guys don't need to see my time. Okay, is this working?
Yes.
And can you see my mouse in case I need that? All right, cool. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. You've actually done some of my work for me in introducing some of what I talked about last year. And I just want to say ahead of time that I printed out because I like to see things on paper, I printed out a lot of the proceedings, and I do it on 4 to 8 pages per piece of paper, and it's still like super thick. So there's a lot of material, and I'm not even going to get close to covering it all. This isn't comprehensive at all, and I probably won't remember everything that we learned. So if you have a question that I can't answer today, I'll try to find an answer, and maybe I can send it to Deborah and she can post it on Workplace or something like that so that everybody has access. So, great. So I'll just talk about kind of some of the impressions that I had and some of the conversations that I've had with Carol and Deborah since, and just highlights of a selection of papers that were presented at the second International Symposium on Academic Makerspaces, which this year was held at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. So this is a link to where you can actually download the proceedings, and as I go through, as I reference specific presentations, I try to remember to put the paper number so that you can look at it later if you find something particularly interesting and want to read deeper. So the symposium runs 3 days from 8:30 to 5 plus poster sessions. So just to give you an idea of the volume of information that comes at you as an attendee to this symposium. It's organized by the Higher Education Maker Initiative, the HEMI group, whom you guys know now because 2 of the West Coast HEMI members actually presented at our August symposium. So they are already fans of the CCC Maker group, and I think are cheering us on. Let's see. So just really briefly, this is a slide from my presentation from last year, just showing some of the themes from 2016. And so ISAM 2017 built on these themes. So last year's meeting was a pretty wide-ranging discussion about safety, education and skills building, startup and logistics, and a lot of these overlapped to have other topics like staffing models or policy and campus relationships and training models. And the nexus of everything that they talked about really had a lot to do with the culture of the makerspace. So for instance, there are a lot of talks about how training models and makerspace culture could lead to an appropriate safety culture. So if you want to go back and watch that, the link is here. Deborah already gave it to you as well, so we can move on to 2017 themes. And while a lot of the discussion did center on some of these things too, I'm going to try to bring out some of the stuff that was new, except for the number one thing, which is makerspace culture. So even it's a very important concept. You guys have all been dealing with it and thinking about makerspace culture while you're developing and building your programs. But just to bring it up, because a lot of talks touched on it or incorporated the idea of culture, even if their main message wasn't specifically about makerspace culture. Another thing that was really important was how to engage the community. So this is kind of an extension of culture, but also how you're using your makerspace, welcoming in the community and considering who might be using it and how. Something that was talked about a little bit more than last year, I think, was data that's collected in the makerspace, and mostly that's user data and who is using the makerspace for what purpose. But there was a lot more development from the first year on what things people wanted to collect. And then finally, there was some talk about defining makerspaces and different ways to classify them, which can be useful later when you're kind of thinking about how you relate to the rest of the CCC Maker network. So just to start with one example of a presentation that talked about maker culture, and that actually had a lot of good discussion and was a good example of a group who thought from the very beginning about collaboration and interdisciplinary studies and research, was Habib University out of Pakistan. And their presentation was called Making in a Liberal Arts Context. And the number right here, number 96, is how you can reference their paper in the proceedings. So what they were talking about is how the culture of making and the practices of making go beyond just the space, and should be thought of as part of the curriculum and the way that you interact with your colleagues, and just move forward in the program that you're in. But they also do have a makerspace, which I'll talk about in just a second. They described themselves as a liberal arts college in a place that is home to a good chunk of humanity, and is in a developing context. So it's a place where there are a lot of complex problems to solve. So they are trying to think of a lot of engineering ideas in the context of social issues. And so their main focus is on having interdisciplinarity, and they want to be working across all different fields. They are a new institution. I think that they were formed in 2014, and they combine 4 core disciplines. So electrical engineering, computer science, social development and policy, and communication and design. And so as they're thinking through their program, they're purposely designing it so that they have collaboration between fields. And they said that the magic is in the interdisciplinary work. So they thought ahead. They tried to make sure that their faculty weren't separated, that they're housed in common areas. So engineer's office is right next door to a biology faculty office. They had faculty co-teaching courses. So a public health faculty and cell biology faculty will be teaching a course together. And they wanted to make sure that they're emphasizing things like project-based learning across all of these fields. But even with all of these ingredients, they still found that they were coming up against unanticipated barriers. And so when they started seeing things happen, like engineering students not feeling comfortable enough to walk into what they called this jealously guarded film studio that the design students were using, they thought that they should take a step back and see why. What is that? Okay, I have a notification, but hopefully that'll go away. That they should take a step back and think about their culture and what they might have missed in their planning. So they actually asked for help from the D School at Stanford, and went through a design thinking workshop. So they sat down with some faculty and students and did interviews and tried to empathize with student learning experiences and expectations, and asked them questions like, how do you define a good learning experience? And why are you making? Why is this important to you? And so they designed some learning experiences around that, and then also worked with D School to help them design what they call the playground, which they wanted to be a very welcoming and communal space. So they started to adjust their culture by making sure that the playground was a flexible learning space, both in the way that it's physically set up, but also in the way that it's managed, and the expectations of the people who use it are set out. So students and faculty are able to initiate and hold workshops, which was important to a lot of students so that they could have ownership of the space. And just making sure that there's a really central community-based design for everybody to go through. So when you enter into this making world, you go into this communal space where you're able to do sort of soft prototyping with low-tech materials, and it's just a very easy entry-level way to come in. And then once you get through that, then you can move on to more advanced rooms or off buildings that are not necessarily connected, but only once you need that. So everybody goes through this gateway, and it had sort of a equalizing effect. So that's just an example of a group that was thinking through what the student needs were, what the faculty needs were, and constantly adjusting and trying to make sure that they were not married to their ideas, and continually responding to changing needs and barriers that come up with that they didn't expect. Another example of a group that was looking carefully at maker culture was Montana State University. And the reason that I chose this is because they went to the trouble to really carefully define what they meant by maker culture, because they wanted to be able to have a baseline for determining whether they were actually able to diversify from where they're starting, to see if the change in programming or any other changes in the makerspace were having an impact on diversity. And so this group specifically defined maker culture as both covering who is using the space, but also what they're working on. So the purpose of using the space is important to thinking about the culture as well. And the definition of diversity in the maker culture would mean that students were representing a wide cross-section of disciplines that are using space for various purposes. So people from different colleges using things for academic classes, personal projects, workshop projects that are specifically within the makerspace, club projects, and things like that. And so then they, with surveys and sign-in data, got themselves a baseline. And you can see here on the top is a pie chart of who's using this space. And that big black, almost everything, means that pretty much everybody is from the College of Engineering. There's a tiny little wedge of people from other colleges. So they don't appear very diverse yet, but at least they know where they're starting. And then the next one down is the purpose, why people are actually in the makerspace. And the two largest wedges, I think, are both their research and coursework. So there aren't a whole lot of people using it for personal projects, for instance. But they have a baseline now, and so what they're going to do is think about how they can expand their user diversity in this space. And so some of the ideas that they came up with and are going to be testing, I guess, this year, are having workshops that have wide appeal. So, for instance, having a festive skills building workshop, so making gifts for your family around the holidays, something that doesn't have anything to do with anybody's discipline. And also getting people to come in to do personal stuff that they really are going to want to invest time in. Another thought that they had is that about half of the students who go to Montana are from out of state. So their assumption is that they're there for other things that Montana has to offer, like the mountains and nature. So they thought that if they had workshops that celebrated those things, which is trying to meet their users at their interest level, Things like making their own ski waxing station, or making a fly fishing rod, or other skills that are important to learn for hiking, and fixing your own technical gear while you're backpacking. Those kinds of things, to just get a broad spectrum of people to come in and participate. And then they also realize that it's very important to be reaching out to faculty across disciplines, because the more faculty who know about you, the more students will hear about you. So that all sounds great. But as one of the presenters said at the conference, you really have to invite people in. It's not enough to just open your doors and say, we're here, hopefully you'll come in. You have to be really proactive about it. And this first quote came from the University of Chicago, who has had a lot of involvement in their space, and they have a membership now of 3,200. So they've seen a lot of growth over 2 years of being in existence. And they started to look at what has driven their user engagement. And they think that one of the things is that when people come in to make things, instead of starting with the question, how are you going to do it? They ask, why are you going to do it? Why are you invested in this? And let's think through that part first. Another thing that they think is really important is having low-tech materials that aren't as intimidating to people just walking in. Eliminating jargon, and identifying and removing barriers to success. So just thinking through what people are seeing as they're walking in the door, what might be intimidating, what might be inviting. I think that this was the group who was making sure that they were putting up in the front of their lab low-tech, interesting things, and then the scarier stuff really far back. So they were just thinking about the layout as people were walking in. But they also identified a lack of experience with specific software as a really big barrier to people coming in and using what was available. And so they made sure that they were training users, but they also made sure that they were not only training users on this new software, the software that's new to them, but also matching them up and helping them form relationships with mentors in the space to help them get through the training, so that they felt comfortable and welcome and wanted in the space. And the other thing that this group said was important was being proactive and inviting people. So having special events for certain student groups, like engineering, art, or biotech clubs. Anytime you hear about a student group that's trying to put on an event that has anything to do with invention or innovation, go and reach out to them directly and say, hey, you may be interested in knowing that we have this space available for you. Maybe we can have your event here. So just going out of your way to actually bring people in. And one of my very favorite quotes, I had two favorite quotes, and I'll try to remember to share the other one at the end, but I think my favorite quote came from a librarian from the University of Toronto who said, have you actually invited them in with your face? Use your face to bring people in. And she was talking about how important it is to develop personal relationships, and that there's a lot of power in a personal invitation versus something that's more like a passive invitation, which is important, something like posters or social media, which is good for getting the word out, but doesn't have the same weight and pull. Deborah was mentioning that I was going to touch on the fact that libraries have been emerging as something that's really important in academic makerspaces. And part of the way that I can talk about that is that a lot of the really good talks that I want to bring up today were made by librarians and talking about academic makerspaces in libraries. One of these talks was from the University of Virginia, and the librarian was looking at two makerspaces, one at Temple University and the other at University of Virginia, and wanting to answer the question, how can we get more humanities researchers into our library makerspaces? So this is just another look at how to engage people in the community that maybe aren't just wandering in by themselves. And this presentation was great because they spelled out kind of this unique role that libraries can fulfill. They're typically departmentally agnostic was the term he used, and they cater to all faculty, staff, students, and community members. But they still found that they have barriers to entry. And so even though they wanted to piggyback on this idea that libraries are this academically neutral space, they realized that adding technology was actually, technology that you would only see in STEM fields was actually proving to be a mental barrier for some of the humanities researchers. And so they did work on trying to first break down any physical barriers to entry. So both of these spaces are, I didn't put any pictures in for this, which is a shame, but both of these spaces are in the main floor of the library and have no walls. And one of them is even surrounded by this study area. So you could accidentally wander into this makerspace and not realize that you're in there until you look around and see tools sitting next to you. And that was completely on purpose, just so that there was no barrier that you had to worry about physically. And then there's low activation energy to actually get into the space. So then they started working on the other barriers. So one of the barriers, one of the issues that they recognize with humanities researchers is that I guess there's a lot of frustration with technology. And so they wanted to know how to ease that burden and just allow people to see themselves using the technology in this space. So one of the things that they thought was really important is that you staff a makerspace with people from very diverse backgrounds and skill levels. So the departments that were represented in the staff in these two library makerspaces were science, architecture, history, engineering, business. There were undergrads and graduates. There were library staff and postdocs. So there is a breadth of disciplinary background and also a really broad spectrum of skills. Not everybody is an expert in everything, but they can still be helpful in a makerspace. And walking into a space where not everybody is an expert can ease your transition into that space. So there was an anecdote that he told about one biomed student feeling a lot more comfortable prototyping in this space because she didn't feel that she had an inferiority complex. And she said that she was just surrounded by historians, and what do they know? So she felt very comfortable prototyping in that space. And somebody from Mount Holyoke College, whose paper is number 67, if you're interested in this anecdote, said something similar about hiring people. This was actually in a discussion after a presentation, but she said, it's really important to be able to staff a place with a bunch of different people so that the users who come in can see themselves in the space. And also just to staff basically non-engineers. And she suggested somebody like a digital musician would be a really interesting addition to a makerspace staff that could connect with people in a lot of different ways. Let's see, they also encourage collaboration and working on personal projects. And they said that outreach had a major role in attracting makers to the space. So having workshops and training, encouraging staff and users to blog about successes and failures in the space, and to try to publish results in journals was also something that would draw certain researchers in. And then one thing that was cool that they did is both libraries had a prominent display case of artifacts that were made in this space. And on all of the mandatory freshman tours of the area, that was a big stop. So there would be a lot of discussion about why these artifacts were here. And then they'd find the makerspace there. So I am gonna move on to a little different topic. This was definitely not a big theme at all, unfortunately. There wasn't a lot of talk about specific coursework, certainly not courses that were built from the ground up to incorporate the Makerspace, which is something that CCC Maker is doing that isn't being done at least isn't being discussed very much in the academic Makerspace world. But there was this one talk by an English professor, and I think he was also the head of his Makerspace, but in all the other respects, he seemed to stand out a lot. And he basically talked about a new kind of knowledge in the post-Makerspace world. And his paper is very worth reading. It's just a philosophy of how we should be thinking about what we know. And one point that he made is that in the way that the world is going now and how we are thinking about knowledge, we should be thinking beyond the limits of certain tools and spaces. But the Makerspace is the perfect home for this anti-disciplinary project-based learning, just kind of a more holistic picture of things, and understanding that we're starting to come to in thinking about new ways to educate. And so he said that Makerspace designers can anticipate and encourage projects like these that would fit into this new kind of knowledge by working toward dialogue across disciplines that in the end doesn't necessarily need to belong to a specific program or degree or have a specific title. And so moving into that way of thinking about education is something that he was just kind of pointing out. And that presentation stood out because it was really different from all the other ones. So just a couple more examples of ways that learning was happening in Makerspaces. The first from Drexel University. This paper was about a first-year engineering program in an academic Makerspace. And basically, it was just talking about these two courses that happen in the first year of engineering. They were not redesigned to integrate with the Makerspace, but there were modules added to them that used the Makerspace. And one of them was this SuperCap car challenge, where the student would build a powered toy car to compete in a distance trial challenge. And so they would use digital and physical design, prototyping tools, fabrication tools in the course of that module. And then the other module they did, which sounded really cool, is making music. And so the student has to create a functional self-playing musical instrument. And so they would become familiar with Arduino, breadboard circuits, design and fabrication using laser cutters, 3D printers, milling equipment. So just starting to introduce the engineering students to the tools that were available to them in their Makerspace through a module in their course is kind of the way this modular incorporation of Makerspace is something that is a lot more common than people actually trying to make an entire new curriculum that really uses the Makerspace. But something else that was really interesting, because it wasn't engineering focused, is the University of Minnesota, who has a course that they just piloted called Writing in the Making. And it's a technical writing course, but it's built around this semester-long design challenge. So students were required to identify a design problem, collect user data, determine solutions, and create and test prototypes, and then compose a recommendation report. And so that was their main project, was their main thing to get out of it was the report. But along the way, they're learning a whole bunch of cool things. And the idea is that the field of technical writing has been evolving a lot, both in content and context, because nowadays technical writers often work really closely with design teams and engineers and need to learn these collaborative skills and understanding how the other team is working. But the instruction of the field hasn't followed along with that development. And so the technical writing field has had a void in a lot of their curricula where students aren't given the opportunity to practice writing in teams. And they learned through this process, students learned that the iterative process is messy and can be difficult, and things aren't necessarily done in a clear-cut order. So maybe there's a little bit more empathy for the design team and the engineers as they're writing their more technical products. And then finally, Habib University again had another presentation. So they have a lot of interdisciplinary courses under design, and the goal is to have the playground, their makerspace, be an integral part of all of the courses. But what I thought was interesting is that they're thinking through the criteria to assess how effective these courses are. And the questions that they're asking are really similar to the ones that CCC Maker has already been considering. So over the course of the year or over the course of the 4 years, are the projects that students taking on becoming more sophisticated? Are they learning more about their projects? Is industry seeing this program as a positive thing, and are they attaching extra significance to graduates of this program in particular? Is the fact that students are going through this desirable for industry partners to start relationships with the school? And then also what career choices are opening up for graduates, and how is their career progression being affected by this course of study? And I know that maybe with a little different phrasing, a lot of these questions are things that are being considered by the CCC Maker group. So I think that's really cool. So I have, there were a lot of presentations on data that are collected in Makerspaces and about Makerspaces, but I was just going to go through one example because every group has different needs and different reasons to collect data. And Georgia Tech's shared user management system was just a really nice illustration of things that you can do with really simple data, stuff that you can look at. So on the left here is a table of what sorts of metrics are collected at some of the HEMI makerspaces. So all of the HEMI makerspaces are listed in the paper, but this is just a quick one. So really basic stuff, often information about which school the student belongs to, what discipline, their training record, how often they're using the space, and all of these kinds of things. This particular system was run by sliding cards and entering information into touchscreen kiosk computers that were set up either at the entry of different rooms or right by specific equipment that needed a certain sign-in. So they're able to track not only who enters the makerspace, but what areas of the makerspace are being used. And then when a student signs in, information about that student's demographics are collected, and then also the equipment that they're using. So that is really helpful if you're wanting to track and manage equipment. So the first time in this system, the first time a student logs in, they sign a safety agreement. So that is one way to track this little bar chart. It's a way to track new users. So as soon as you sign a safety agreement, you're tagged as a new user. And then once that safety agreement is signed, your information, or the student's information, is ported in from the registrar. So academic standing, the school, their major, the age of the student, and all these other things that you want to look at. So on the left, you can see this data collection is showing you who is using the space. But an example of how equipment can be tracked is looking at how equipment is used over time. So right here on the top, where'd my mouse go? Right here on the top, this is 3D printers. And each of these little clusters represents usage over a week. And so this is the number of unique users using the 3D printer. This is average hours per user. What is this? This is the total hours. And then this is the equipment hours. Each of these lines represents a different 3D printer. So if you see one hasn't been used for a while, you think, okay, well, that probably either needs maintenance or it's low on filament or something like that. So you can actually start to see how the equipment is being used and working in your space. And then you can also track which tools are being used the most. So here you can see that the wood room and the 3D printers are the most popular during this month that they were looking at data. So those kinds of things are important so that you can be allocating resources properly, doing management of, maintenance of your equipment properly, all that kind of stuff. That's sort of the level of data that are being collected in the Makerspaces. When I get excited and see a block of talks about metrics in Makerspaces, that's what they end up talking about. But another thing that can be looked at is what services are being provided by the Makerspace. And so this isn't really the way that the presenter framed it, but thinking of the program, I think it's really cool to be able to look and see if you can, with simple collection techniques, see what kinds of services are valuable to your users. So this was a survey that was given to students to quantify how valuable this student-run makerspace is at MIT. Students have to constantly justify funding for it, and so they just wanted to be able to say, like, this is a valuable resource to the student body. And what they found is that while students came to use the tools, a lot of the time they stayed in this space even though it didn't have as many tools as some of the other makerspaces, because they so valued the student community. Not only were they there to meet people and connect with friends, so it was a social environment, they also found that there was a lot of added value in helping them to have a deeper understanding of their coursework, because they felt like they could ask student mentors for help there. So it turned out to have an unexpected value that the students could then take and justify their funding. Okay, I have to hurry now. I'm going to breeze through this because it is just funny, but all I wanted to say about this is that Yale came up with a classification system so that makerspaces could be compared within classes, so that when you're talking about best practices, you know, maybe it doesn't help so much if you're talking about a 500 square foot space versus a 10,000 square foot space, and best practices don't necessarily translate between the two of those. So they came up with this whole system of classifying makerspaces based on the scope, accessibility, how many users are using it, the square footage of the space, and the staffing model that's being used. And they were talking about next year actually identifying people on their badge by this designator, which is maybe not a good way to have a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. But it's interesting to think about that, because something like this could be useful within the CCC Maker network, because there's a lot of variability even within the network, to just kind of give you context as you compare between yourselves, what kind of resources you have, what sorts of tool lists you might be aspiring to have, what kind of programming works in certain kinds of spaces. So just adapting this to whatever skills you need could be really useful just for helping with comparisons. And I'm missing one. Okay. Another classification that was interesting was this researcher from Germany took a look around at all of the, a lot of the makerspaces in the area that he was interested in, and tried to classify them based on their, what he called their maker movement elements. So he defined it in the way that this is listed here, but if you wanted to think of it as just different aspects of the maker movement that you find important or that you really want to communicate in your makerspace, or services that you want to be sure your makerspace is providing, can be a really helpful exercise to help you think through where your makerspace is in relation to just the makerspace universe. It could be helpful to help you focus your vision and sort of get a story going about what it is that your makerspace accomplishes that is either similar to or different from others. And so sort of help you move toward a narrative that explains the value that your makerspace or your maker program contributes to your network or your community. So these kinds of classifications can just be really good exercises to sort of think of how to position yourself and how you are positioned and maybe where you are relative to where you want to go. So some take-homes. Culture and community are always important considerations. It was talked about a lot directly and indirectly this year as it was the first year, and it will continue to be talked about because it's the cornerstone of a successful makerspace. There seemed to be a little bit more focus this year on collecting data about who was using the spaces and what they were doing there. What was very interesting is that there was a lot more grumbling in the audience this year than last year about the lack of any metrics or description about student experience and the impact of makerspaces on student learning and workforce readiness. So there was a lot more commenting on that this year. So hopefully next year there will be a little bit more discussion on that or work in that direction. A big difference this year was who was participating. So I brought up several presentations that were given by librarians or people representing their library makerspaces, but there was this whole block of library academic makerspaces, and they were hardly represented in the first symposium. And this group of presentations gave a different perspective than a lot of the other presentations. And so it was really cool to see them present together and have a really kind of unified message about the value of the library in this space. And moving forward, I think that CCC Maker can have that same sort of impact if coming together as a group with one voice and one message about how the community colleges in this very big network that is not like what we're seeing anywhere else in this discussion, what they have to say. I think that would be really cool. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was that CCC Maker seems to be getting some fans. So already a couple of the Hemi people who have presented to us are really excited about CCC Maker, but I was noticing that the member from Yale was asking funding questions on behalf of community colleges, and the information didn't end up being necessarily helpful, but the fact that he really wanted to be involved in helping the community colleges or just somehow attached to what is happening is really exciting. So there's space for community colleges to speak. There's opportunity for the community colleges to lead and to elevate the conversation, because there are places where work in CCC Maker is happening that is not being discussed in the academic makerspace arena. So I'm kind of losing my train of thought because I'm trying really hard to hurry. But it would be great to have a block of CCC Maker presentations at next year's ISAM. So far, CCC Maker has been represented sort of at the program overview level, but getting college level experiences in there and having anecdotes that people can relate to and just sharing ideas of what you've all been working on would be really powerful. The other thing that's I've said already that would be wonderful to share is how the network is working out. There's nothing like this going on. This is a state level multi-campus thing. The closest thing that's going on is MIT relating its 40 makerspaces that are on its campus, or University of Indiana doing the same thing. That's the closest that I've heard at these symposia about networking makerspaces. So what you're doing is at a scale that nobody is dealing with yet, and it's really powerful, and people are getting excited. So looking forward, just thinking about sustainability, when trying to sell the vision of what you're doing and how you fit in with the network, it's really good to have a strong network. I don't have any notes on this, so I lost my train of thought on it. But strengthening your network connections can make the entire group an even more attractive place to want to sponsor. So we were talking last week about how a lot of the mention of entrepreneurial, of partnering with businesses at the university level is basically done in corporate sponsorships. And so it's like businesses giving gigantic amounts of money, or building entire 4-story buildings that could be makerspaces. And that may not be the model that works for community colleges, but having an entire statewide network, that could be something that's really attractive, maybe to if the network wanted to pursue something like corporate sponsorship or funding. The other thing that's important is getting your story down for when you're sharing your value for your maker network and your particular maker program, and how you fit into your network, what you're adding to your community, and how you're uniquely contributing to your network, to your students, to your community. These kinds of stories are important to start developing. So thinking of how you can classify your network, your makerspace, thinking of the services that you're providing, all of these are important for thinking ahead to how to sustain your space and your program. So all of that leads up to what Deborah actually mentioned already, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. The spring symposia will be largely focused on the work that you're all doing and trying to tease out each of your unique stories and what you're all contributing to the space. What would be really great is if we could develop a group of white papers to submit to ISAM, and I put this asterisk here to remind me to tell you that I'm happy to help develop the white papers if anybody wants to team up on that. I think it would be good to maybe curate a couple of stories so that we have a message going into ISAM, and then present papers in that arena. And the end goal isn't just to go and talk to a bunch of academics about how cool you are. The end goal is to use that as a way to kind of focus your understanding of where you fit in, how the work you're doing is really important, and how it's different and contributing novel things to the entire space of makerspaces. So I think that there is a lot of space for CCC Maker to be at the table, have a voice, and lead some higher level discussions than we've heard so far at ISAM. So I think that that's it. These are links to this year and last year, and if you have questions, you can email me. And I hope I haven't gone too far over time. I apologize. Yeah. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks very much, Bree. That was really interesting and really great. I love hearing your perspective on it. I know that Carol and I share a lot of the impressions that you just shared with us today. And the only other thing I'd add to it is that when it comes to the CCC Maker, the importance of our work in this and sharing it with the ISEM community, we're looking at a scope and a scale that far exceeds anything that is being done today, and that alone makes our work unique. But I think the other really strong point is that we are focusing on workforce development with the internship component directly in there. And that is also something that's not so representative in the makerspaces in the academic environment, but we do see those connections to things like ThinkBox and the other entrepreneurial incubators that are often attached to these at the college level. So we sort of live in a bit of a parallel universe almost. There's a lot of points where we touch, but there's some other things that make us really distinct, and it's interesting, I think, to this community. And I think the dialogue that we can create through this forum is really important for our own sustainability, also to keep us moving into the future. So I want to thank you very much for that. Carol, did you want to make any comment? Oh, yeah.
Well, Bree, I just want to thank you. I think having your insight and stepping back and remembering all that went on is really important. I mean, given the amount of papers that are presented, it's amazing that you can come out with any nuggets, because it's really on overload, and every paper is valid and has some really interesting pieces of it. But I've got to tell you that I know in your final conclusions, it's just so touching to me that you feel that we can have a voice and that we are making a difference, and that really means a lot, given that you have the bigger picture. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your kind of your guidance, and your looking back kind of at us as a force in California is really, really valuable.
That was really sweet. Thanks. I'm just happy to be attached to this project. It's really exciting. It's hard. It's hard for the people who weren't there to see how different this is. It's really different. And I think that it's easy to fall into, oh, well, we're just starting out. And this was the takeaway from last year. Oh, we're just starting out. Like, they have so much funding. They're so big. Everybody is just starting out. But this group is starting out at a huge scale. And the goals are so much clearer and focused. It's really cool. Let me go back on mute.
I think the promise that will come, and it may take another 3 to 5 years, are really some of the research that'll be driven by the HEMI group around the evaluation of the impact to students. There's virtually no research on that right now, and everyone, like you say, Bree, they're starting to clamor for it.
And I don't know if you guys got this, but I just yesterday got an announcement about a measuring impacts of your makerspace on the student experience class. It costs $2,700 to attend, but it's put on by somebody in HEMI, and so
Marty Culpepper,
probably. Yeah. So I think they heard it, because there was definitely some grumbling, not only in the audience, but also, so there was an app for the conference, and there was a lot of chatter on that, and people were talking about, why aren't people talking about the student experience? Why aren't people talking about academic metrics? It's just a completely different viewpoint. It's really interesting that that's lacking still on the second year, but people are starting to get impatient.
I've just saw we have a question about where these slides will be available, and the webinar. We'll be posting the webinar on the website along with the slide deck, and you should be seeing that probably in the next couple of days, early next week. So I'd strongly recommend that you share it. So I'm just going to finish this. Share it with everyone in your community. Share these links, and really take these valuable 1-hour webinars and really start using them as part of your promotion within your community. I noticed also that Karen made a comment earlier on about telling your stories through blog posts. when we're talking about the white papers, you know, a white paper could develop from a blog post that you've made about a particular item or area of work or a particular event. That could be the starting point. The blog post, not necessarily just in itself, but it could offer an insight or it could spark an idea. And when you start looking at your blog posts and your social media and all of this work together, it helps you to distill down to what a valuable white paper could be that could help further our work in growing our community. And I'd also say this isn't just for the ISAM conference. It's also valuable for you know, developing a white paper or some form of communication is useful for your board of trustees, your community, other local and state conferences and workshops. So there's a lot of value in this work, and we're here to help you do that. Thanks to Carol's leadership, we have 2 of these white papers under our belt, and we've presented at both ISAM conferences in the last 2 years. So this is an area where we can really offer assistance to help you elevate your thinking, your critical thinking about your area, and also your communication with your community. So, and that's a bit of a segue into next week's webinar, which will be on social media. So if you tune in again next week, we'll be talking about workplace and Twitter and how all of these systems can work together to help get your message out and tell your story. So thank you very much, everyone, today. I know we went a couple of minutes over, but it's been a great presentation, and thank you very much, Bree, for joining us. It was excellent. Thank you, everyone. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact me offline. Okay then, thanks. Bye.